So concept 4, we're going to discuss the problem of defining and maintaining an identity for Native Americans in the United States and the 7 historical patterns that demonstrate the historical relationship between the white man and Native Americans. And then we'll be watching a film, Spirit of Crazy Horse. So after watching the film, The Spirit of Crazy Horse, identify one example from the film of each of the 7 historical patterns. And this will further explain, the Spirit of Crazy Horse will help explain more of assimilation, which we're not going to get too much into towards the end of this concept here. So, before we get into the 7 historical patterns, defining what it means to be Native Americans is quite problematic. The major problem the Native Americans has in society today is it's one of establishing an identity. Native Americans remain probably some of the most misunderstood Americans of all. They share no common native language and few common customs, but they do have some common traits, right? Even though most people not necessarily dismiss Native Americans as just Native Americans, but we have an idea that there is something that unifies all Native Americans across the country, and it just simply isn't so. We're talking about a very diverse group of people. I mean, it would be equally as crazy as thinking that all Europeans are alike. So if you understood what someone from Ireland is like, that would give you the assumption of what somebody from Italy was like, since they're both Europeans, right? Italians and Irish people are incredibly different. So are Cherokee and Paiute people, right? Incredibly different people. They share a common past, mainly a common enemy, but nonetheless, they're very different people from each other. Our treatment, meaning not our treatment, but historically, Americans' treatment of Native Americans during our past still affects the national conscience. We have been hampered by the history and our relationship with Native Americans and our efforts to develop a fair national policy governing present and future treatment of Native Americans. So before we can develop a successful policy to work with Native Americans, we have to know where we have been in the past. Hence, it seems as a basic requirement to study the history of Native American. The problem of identity for the Native American can best be demonstrated by the use of the word Indian. So what and who is an Indian? There's no clear answer to this question, since different people apply different definitions. Generally, however, most definitions rest either upon a cultural or racial basis, with the former being most widely in Latin America and the latter in the United States. In Mexico, for example, people are generally proud of being of Native ancestry, but do not consider themselves to be Native Americans unless they speak a native language and live in a native community. A Mexican of pure native descent, or even a person of mixed racial descent, participating fully in Mexican national culture does not ordinarily think of himself or herself as Native American. In brief, from a Latin American perspective, to be a Native American is also to live a native way of life. In the United States, there's a tendency to define a person by racial background rather than by his way of life. For example, the federal government defines an Indian as a person of 1/4 or more United States Indian descent who resides upon federal trust land or reservation, or who has preserved membership in a tribe occupying a trust land. The frustration with the term Indian can be best demonstrated with the following quote by Dennis Banks. "Even the name Indian is not ours. It was given to us by some dumb honky who got lost and thought he landed in India." So everyone knows Columbus can be blamed for much of the confusion. Many Europeans avoided the problem for several centuries by ignoring Columbus's mistake. They referred to Native Americans simply as Americans. But European immigrants came to appreciate the term American, applied it to themselves, and reverted back to Columbus's label of Indians. In fact, in the mid 19th century, the term Native American would have been applied to white Anglo people who were resentful of Irish and Italian immigrants coming in and competing for jobs. So it was kind of a way of kind of it was an expression of xenophobia for some time period, from a little bit after the Civil War through much of the 1900s or the 1800s. Conflict in cultures comprise one of the great barriers to any real understanding of Native Americans and the problems of adjustment to American society that still exist today. The core of the problem of identity stems from the fact that the Native American has a non-Western culture and is trying to find his identity within a dominant Western culture. Until recent times, the Native American has been included in our society, although Native Americans have been impacted by its development. This has made it difficult to preserve the basis of their culture, traditions, and philosophy of life. And you'll get a good sense of that when you watch the film The Spirit of Crazy Horse. What do we got here? I think we could, let's just keep it going through this clip here. So we're going to look at the 7 historical patterns that demonstrate the relationship between, generally speaking, the white man and Native Americans. And again, generally speaking, Native Americans. So the first pattern, the pattern of the attitude of superiority, was established early when first contact of Native Americans and whites began with Christopher Columbus, who wrote that these Indians would make good servants in his journal. Hence, the history of Native American-white relations commenced with the white man's declaration of superiority over the red man. The second pattern, which rests upon the first pattern, if you're going to exploit somebody, you must feel that you're superior to them. The pattern of exploitation was first developed by the Spaniards, who had enslaved the Native Americans in the mission system and took them back to Europe as slaves. The French, the English, the Americans as well also participated in this pattern through the fur trade. By use of the fur trade practice, the Native Americans killed off their own wildlife, which had been the basis of their culture for hundreds of years, in order to obtain products from whites, and thus they became technological junkies. Because of this dependence upon white culture, this in turn would lead to the destruction, or at least the hindrance of their own culture. The fur trade, we've got to be careful of the word destruction of their culture, because despite great difficulties with their history, a lot of their culture has been preserved by just sheer cultural pride, which is a remarkable feat given what has happened in the past. The fur trade is also an example of cultural dominance and undermining influence of Western culture. The third pattern is the pattern of divide and conquer. It's also the pattern of exploitation, as the Europeans stimulated the natural conflicts between Native Americans, which is important to understand. We have this idea that Native Americans kind of are, again, like one people and they all got along. They were different people, and like all human beings, they fought with each other. And so Europeans and later Americans were able to exploit that by pitting them against each other. And in doing so, once they're pitted against each other, it's easy to conquer them. They would use them in order to use them as allies in wars against other Europeans, native tribes who sided with Europeans. An example of this can be seen with the French and Indian War. The Iroquois were given 30 wagons loaded of gifts, including guns, to keep them loyal to the British. At the same time, the French were making use of the Algonquins against the British. A second, and just as important example of divide and conquer will be seen in the film The Spirit of Crazy Horse. So it's a more modern example of how a people has been divided and conquered. So watch for that, for specific examples of that when you're watching the film. The fourth pattern is a pattern of conflict over land. It developed soon after the British arrived in North America. Initially, both the British and Native Americans were friendly, generally speaking, and Native Americans even taught the British how to raise corn and other crops in order to survive, for trading purposes mainly. But thus developed this notion of the noble savage as a stereotype, which is an example of superiority, and was first developed by Columbus. But the friendly spirit disappeared as the number of whites increased, and the British sought to remove Native Americans from their lands. As the conflict over territorial expansion developed, the image of the Native American changed from noble savage to brutal savage, without civilization or religion, who did not believe in private property, the Christian God, and the power of the King of England. So cultural nationalism was used as a justification to remove Native Americans from their land. For example, the Puritan justified seizure of native lands with the book of Genesis. Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it. Right? From the Puritan perspective, early Massachusetts settlement, it was obvious that they weren't subduing the land properly. Thus, the Massachusetts General Court declared in 1652, quote, Indians within this jurisdiction have just right there to only those lands they have, quote, by possession or improvement, unquote. Most Puritans considered the Bible-based policy not only divinely inspired, but also just and fair. John Winthrop concluded, quote, if we leave them sufficient land for their own use, we may lawfully take the rest, there being more than enough for them and us, unquote. And that perspective of this idea of the Americas being vast and infinite would really be impactful to Native Americans, because it became very easy to justify, let's just move them farther west. Let's move them farther west. They can be happy being Indians out there, and we could be happy being English out here, and Americans and all of that kind of stuff, right? Without conflict, which introduces all sorts of problems, which we'll briefly look at in just a little bit. Pattern number 5, the land acquisition by treaty, developed under the new government of the United States as it was an attempted solution to settle the problems that developed as a result of pattern number 4, the conflict over land. In the beginning, the United States government stated that Native Americans possessed rights to the soil they occupied and could not be disposed without their consent. This laid the foundation for pattern 5, as the treaty-making process was made the legal way to drive Native Americans from their land. The initial solution to the problem of land acquisition was to force the removal of Native Americans to the West. In 1784, the nation's first treaty with the Native Americans was negotiated at Fort Stanwix with the Iroquois, who agreed to relinquish their claims to part of western New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. The treaty set a pattern for Native American affairs until 1871, as the treaty process came to an end. Treaties took advantage of Native Americans were negotiated in one of 3 ways. By use of inadequate interpreters for natives at treaty councils. So there was a language barrier, in other words. Alcohol at treaty councils. You get them drunk and they'll sign anything. That's kind of the idea. And unrepresentative signers, which is basically Western English law and American law has a concept of republicanism, this idea that people in power who were elected have the authority and the right to make laws, and in doing so, we who are not in power have to abide by those laws, right? In a lot of Native American cultures, if a chief makes a decision, and I'm not the chief, I don't necessarily have to abide what the chief decided, right? There was a greater sense of personal autonomy in a lot of Native American cultures. So what would happen is there would be a treaty signed with the Cherokee or the Creeks or the Seminoles, and that treaty was between a man who was recognized as the chief by maybe the American government. So he made that decision for himself and maybe parts of his tribe. But other parts of the tribe might have had different ideas, and since they weren't there to sign it, they felt like there would be no problem in doing so. So this would ensue conflict, right? You would have Native Americans who would, quote-unquote, violate the treaties because they weren't present at the signing of the Treaty Council. And so they would see it as, well, that's what that guy decided, not me. And so you would have problems with that circumstance. As the pattern of conflict over land continued to develop, treaties showed themselves merely to be stopgap measures, as eventually settlers would move on to the land designated for natives, ignoring their rights, and would try to move them off. When conflict ensued, the settlers demanded military protection. This process started in 1791 in the Northwest Territory and continued up until the 1870s in the Black Hills, when Custer was asked to go and protect the gold seekers who were mining on the Sioux Reservation. The sixth pattern, after pattern 5 showed itself to only be temporary, pattern 6, isolation, developed in 1830 with the passage of the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 empowered the president to exchange land west of the Mississippi for territory east of the river that was held by Native Americans. So by 1850, most of the surviving eastern tribes in the southeast, or about 93,000 Native Americans, were relocated beyond Mississippi to present-day Oklahoma. That's. Let me bring up a map here. So basically, when we talk about the Indian Removal Act, we're talking about all of these people: the Seminoles, the Creeks, the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws. Beginning in the 1830s, all the way up to the 1850s, they were forcibly removed and taken to modern-day Oklahoma, where they were seen as they were going to be seen as having one big reservation. And so this initiates the so-called reservation system. The purpose of this policy, again, was to create one big reservation out of the central grasslands. Modern-day Oklahoma. The Indian Removal Act primarily affected powerful nations of the southeast, the so-called 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokees, the Creek, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles. The implementation of this policy produced one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Trail of Tears, which you probably studied in U.S. History 1, but it was the forcible removal of Cherokee people in 1838, which saw the decimation of a quarter of the Cherokee population. About 4,000 people died on that journey. Although the Removal Act, let's see, so the idea at first was to have one big reservation. It was a kind of a simplified idea that this will allow white settlers to gain access to the land, to the frontier, and they'll be happy doing that, and Indians will be happy being Indians out in their one big reservation. Now that's only going to last so much as long as there wasn't a need for that one big reservation, right? So what begins to happen is it moves towards the first steps of concentrated reservations or isolated reservations. So concentrated reservations or isolated reservations is the idea that begins in 1851 when the chief with the Cherokee with the Treaty of Fort Laramie. In returns of gifts and annuities, Lakota or the Sioux agreed to this policy, and so begins this policy of concentrated reservations, where you have here's a depiction of modern reservations across the West. notice how there are very few reservations in this part of the country, right? Most of them are out in here. So from the 1850s through the 1890s to the so-called end of the Indian Wars, natives were relocated out in these areas. And so this would continue and continue. One of the, and which we'll see in, you'll see more in The Spirit of Crazy Horse. I'm going to let The Spirit of Crazy Horse kind of talk more about this period of isolation. But what The Spirit of Crazy Horse is going to look at is this part of the country right here with the Lakota, and it will briefly talk about two major battles. One, the so-called Custer's Last Stand, or Little Bighorn, and then the other one, what you call it? Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee of 1890. Both were very important. Both involved with Lakota, and both were quite horrific. Custer's Last Stand happened when Custer went in trying to get the natives back into their reservation. A battle ensued, and Custer's 7th Cavalry was wiped out. Fast forward 20 years later with Wounded Knee, and you're having kind of a religious revival with Native Americans, and these new religions are being created, one of them being the ghost dance. So practitioners of the ghost dance were told to stop since it was creating a bunch of anxiety, and in doing so, Lakota people and Cheyenne people refused to practice the ghost dance, and so Wounded Knee saw the killing of nearly 300 men, women, and children of Lakota and Cheyenne descent, practitioners of the ghost dance. And this ghost dance was happening all over the western United States. Going up to the 7th pattern of assimilation. In this lecture, I'm just going to talk about the Dawes Act, and the film will talk about other aspects of assimilation. But in 1887, amidst the bloodshed of the Indian Wars, again, the Indian Wars are generally happened between 1860 and 1890, and they were bloody. We might watch a few film clips to show Hollywood dramatizations of how violent they indeed were. But amidst that, there was also a policy to try to deal with this in a more peaceful, civilized way. So a new policy and pattern were introduced with the passage of the Dawes Act. So according to this act, the president could allot reservation lands individually to natives, the title to be held in trust by the United States for 25 years. After the 25-year period, full citizenship was theoretically to accompany. It didn't. Heads of the family would receive 160 acres, and a single individual would get 80 acres. The surplus land, after Native Americans had been taken care of, was to be sold by the government or would be used for national parks. The Dawes Act was an attempt to assimilate Native Americans. So there was this idea that Native Americans were, the problem with Native Americans was that they were inherently inferior as a people, as was often thought by for other non-white people by Americans. But the problem was their culture. So decimate their culture and assimilate them, and they could become like white people. So the Dawes Act was an attempt to create them to be individualistic, capitalist farmers. So the Dawes Act was an attempt to assimilate the Native American into a culture by completely isolating him from his own culture and forcing him to find his identity within Western society. The results were it failed, right? Part of the significance of the act is that it revealed in the late date that white man's lack of understanding of Native Americans and his value on individual ownership of land. Even if Native Americans wanted to become farmers, much of the land was unfit for subsistence farming, let alone farming for capitalist purposes. The Dawes Act was a huge mistake, but it remained a major policy for dealing with Native Americans until 1933. The result for Native Americans across the country that were afflicted by the Dawes Act was collectively they lost about 2/3 of their land that was allocated to them through the treaty process. And since the land was unfit for any type of real farming, it subjected them to further levels of poverty, abject poverty, which you'll get, again, a sense of in The Spirit of Crazy Horse. So watch that film, and again, identify one example from the film of each of the historical patterns, at least one example. So you're looking for a pattern of superiority, exploitation, divide and conquer, conflict over land, land acquisition by treaty, isolation, and assimilation. So if you're in my internet class, just watch parts 1 through 6. If you're in class, watch them here, and then we'll also watch them in class as well. So I'll talk to you guys later. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns by emailing me or talking to me in class, and I'll see you around. Bye.